Hey everybody, this is a preview of today's members episode. If you want to hear the whole thing, head on over to the confessionalspodcast.com, hit the join button, and become a member today. All right, today we have Seth on the show. Seth, what's going on, man?
Life is good. Good to talking.
Good, man. So thanks for you had to reschedule with me yesterday. I had some truck problems. So I'm glad we were able to get this done though, because it's not every day I get somebody that contacts me that specifically says that they have researched the history of dog-headed men and how it kind of intertwines through the timeline. And I was like, well, I'm interested, so let's do this. I want to give a right off the top here a shout out to your website so that people know where they can find this information and probably more. Which is projecteleazar.com. And we are going to be covering the topic of, and this is where I said I wanted to ask while we're recording. I don't know how to pronounce this. What is this? Cynocephali?
Cynocephali. If you're
Cynocephali.
using the restored classical Latin, it would be the cuneiform. But we just say Cynocephali.
All right. So Cynocephali, and I will not remember to pronounce that again. So from here on forward, I'm going to say a variation of werewolf, dogman, dog-headed man, cryptid, and big scary thing in the forest.
That works.
If that
okay,
works. Sounds
Although,
good.
I will point out at one point here that the werewolf and Cynocephali are different.
Of course they are. Of course they are.
Of course.
I didn't expect it to be that easy.
Yeah.
So let's get into this though, man. How did this kind of start for you? In fact, let's jump into how you came up with the website name, Project Eleazar. I know you and I were talking about that a little bit before we started recording and stuff, and then we'll get into this topic.
Okay, yeah. So Project Eleazar is named after a Bible character. There are several named Eleazar in the Bible, but this guy, specifically this story where he's one of David's mighty men, and he was in battle, and everybody started retreating on the Israelite army. They started retreating back, and he just didn't. He just stayed where he was. They left him alone. He killed off another 200 people all by himself. And then it says the only reason he stopped is because he started to get tired. And then he was fine. He didn't get killed. He just left. Apparently everybody was no match to this guy, and he just walked away. But I loved the symbolism of he was someone who stood firm and didn't retreat when everybody else was retreating. So that's the symbolism that I wanted to bring to the blog.
Do you have any kids?
I do not have any kids right now, no.
Do you plan on naming your firstborn son Eleazar?
Oh,
because that's such a masculine.
It's a pretty awesome name.
Yeah, it's like. Let me tell you where my name comes from.
Yes, yeah, exactly. No, that's definitely on the list.
Yeah, I'd imagine. So, projecteleazar.com, and let's get into the topic though, man. How does this dog-headed man intertwine throughout history? And I know there's other cryptids that have been around for thousands of years. And I even in the email you mentioned about it, which is, I think everybody that listens to this show, I don't want to say everybody because there's always new listeners and stuff, but if you're new, welcome to the party. It gets crazy and I'm nuts. But I think a lot of people who are returning listeners understand that this is a historical issue that humanity has been encountering, dealing with for thousands of years. And it's only until the last several hundred years that it's been debated. And I find it interesting how the timeline kind of parallels each other, where for thousands of years, a very, very long time, the idea of a supernatural realm was never in question until the past couple hundred years. And humanity, not even our culture, humanity, civilization of humanity has shifted into a different worldview that negates a supernatural worldview. And I find how it's interesting how the two parallel each other, where it's like humanity veered away from its thousands of years of understanding that there is a supernatural realm. They weren't stupid. They had reasons for believing that. And around the same time, they're also veering away from talking about, believing in, and understanding that these monsters do exist. These things do exist through many different means. So I find it interesting. Let's get into it, man.
Yeah, so you hit the nail right on the head. That is exactly the situation. As I've been doing all this research, I see that timeline where we hit about the last 300 or 400 years where Darwinism kicks in, materialism kicks in, and we start taking away the supernatural perspective of the world. And then all of a sudden we start saying, no, actually everything that our ancestors believed in was made up. We slap this term mythology on it and we go, those are just stories, even though they were in fact their history books. We say, no. Those are just stories. They made it all up. This is what it really was. They were just confused, right? And it's this claim of ignorance. Well, they weren't as smart as we are. Like, are you sure? Are you sure about that? Because that's where all of our famous philosophy and everything comes from. Like, those were the smartest guys we know. So, so let me back up real quick. So, how I kind of got into all this, I'm a biblical and historical researcher. On the side, the way I make money, my living is actually from software engineering and cybersecurity. And those two things come together in a weird and interesting way for me, because I use a lot of the skills that I've accumulated from my profession to do my research. So I use things like open source intelligence, artificial intelligence, data aggregation, graph analysis to gather information and to then analyze that information. And then, of course, good old-fashioned reading really old things that no one else wants to read. So doing all that, and that all started just from wanting to understand the Bible, wanting to understand, the perspective of the ancient culture. Part of that perspective is, in fact, all of these creatures, right? All these cryptid creatures start popping up. And I've come to realize that if you study history, you either have to end up studying cryptid creatures or you have to ignore it, because they're everywhere. They're just a part of life, just like angels and demons were discussed, just as, the pagan gods of all the nations were discussed. Everybody just acknowledged them as existing. And so you can't read historical accounts without encountering these types of things. So as I encountered them, I started asking questions naturally, right? And one of those was when I ran into this map, which a lot of people have been talking about the last couple of decades, which is called the Piri Reis map. And that map shows a dog-headed creature, like fighting with another creature. But it looks like a person. It almost looks like somebody, wearing a mask or something. I say, why is this individual? Why do they have a dog head? What are they doing in South America? What's going on here, right? And so I saw that, and I was like, okay, like I've heard of Dogman concept, right? But I hadn't seen, a historical representation of one. So I was like, wait a second. Like, I understand maps, and I know that they put depictions of animals that are distinct to a location on that area of the map. Say, oh yeah, this area. Like you put an elephant on Africa, right? It's pretty intuitive. Well, they're putting dogmen in these different areas around the world. And I'm like, wait a second. Like, what's going on here? So I started researching and just found way, way more than I could have possibly expected. It turns out that the dogman concept is one of the most documented cryptid creatures in history, which kind of blew my mind. And as I started digging into this, I realized a lot of what people were saying, even in a good number of the academic communities, was just inaccurate in terms of what ancient historians were actually saying. So ancient historians are saying all sorts of stuff, and then you have the professionals of today, and some of the guys on Reddit or whatever who are like, oh, I found this, right? But the statements made about them were just, simply either had insufficient arguments or were just flat out wrong. Like I've read a lot of these books where they make claims of like, oh yeah, these are the Cynocephali, and this guy said this about them. And then I tracked down that primary source, and they didn't say that. They said something else. So a lot of this journey has been finding, identifying, and then reading and translating these old texts that discuss this topic, so I can just kind of get at the truth.
Yeah, so I mean, first, I have never heard of is it pronounced Piri Reis? Piri Reis?
Yeah, Piri Reis. It's Pirireis. Yeah.
So I've never heard of it, and so you suggested that everybody's seen it. I haven't seen it. So I find this is wild. How old is this map?
So it's from the 1600s, or sorry, 16th century, 1500s. It was originally put together for a sultan, and the guy, it was actually named after Piri Reis, which actually means what does it mean? I think you translate to like admiral. But this guy, he was a cartographer, but he was a world traveler. So he traveled the world, but he also used other maps to put together his map. That's what cartographers have always done. And so that's been a large discussion in kind of this, what would you say? I know that the academics call it, pseudoscience or pseudohistory, but people like Graham Hancock, he points out that map. There have been a lot of people who in the academic community who are discussing it, because some guys are looking at it, they go, oh, look, this is talking about Antarctica. And so there are all these crazy theories about what this map might actually mean, that there was an ancient civilization. And a lot of that stuff, like I went down that rabbit trail, and I don't think that it gives us that. I don't think that it really lends towards the ancient civilization part as much with the Antarctica stuff, as much as it really is an impressive, amazing map that tells us a lot about what they knew about the Americas when they really shouldn't have known that much. So it's still interesting, and it still tells us, wait a second, people knew more than we thought they did, but maybe not in the same way that a lot of people are claiming.
And who made this map again?
So Piri Reis, that is his name. I forget which word. I can't remember if it's Reese or if it's Piri, but one of those words is actually what means admiral, and the other one is his name, and I can't remember which one.
Okay. And he's, I'm assuming, a European that came and mapped everything?
Oh, I'm sorry. So no, this was Arabic, and this was an Arabic map that was put together for the Sultan at that time.
Okay. Wow. So this is Arabic. Gotcha. This is a pretty wild map, man. I'm gonna,
it's really cool.
I'm gonna say this, and if I don't do it, somebody can reach out and ask me to do it. And when I say me, I'm not actually doing it. Somebody else is gonna be doing it. But I'm gonna be making a note for somebody else to put this image on the website so they can check it out, because this is a pretty wild thing. I've never seen that image before. So you're talking about, your research going into all these old texts and stuff. What are some of the things that you're uncovering in these old? Well, first of all, I mean, I guess what are these old texts that you're reading and stuff? I mean, you mentioned about how you're reading texts that other people don't want to read, kind of thing. Yeah. Partly because we don't know how to read that kind of language anymore. It's like, it's like reading the King James version for so many people. It's hard to understand at times.
Very true.
But what are some of these texts that you're reading, and what are you discovering within these texts about anything from, these dog-headed men to other cryptids? Because you mentioned about how cryptids are something that has been riddled through our history, and you're discovering that as you go here.
Yeah, so this is where I get to have fun. So this whole concept of the Dogman, I'm making the argument that based on these texts that I'm gonna go over, and there are way too many for us to go over in one episode, but I found over 30 to 60 texts. I don't mean like somewhere in between. I mean 30 historical ones, 60 if you include mythologies and folklore stuff that isn't as verified. But all of those texts together, spanning over 3,300 years, right? And I'll give you some of the names of those. A lot of them are cited and referenced on the blog post on Cynocephali on my website, but I'm going to walk you through some of them today as well. The discussion has actually been a debate for a long time. Interestingly enough, a lot of these texts are a debate. Not all of them, but tons of them are this debate of, are they in fact animal, or are they in fact a human race? And as time goes on, more and more ancient scholars started agreeing that they were in fact a human race that was just a hybrid, what they refer to as a monstrous race. And so my argument is that I don't actually even consider Dogman a cryptid creature anymore. I consider it a cryptid race, because for so long people have actually said, no, these are people. They just have the head of a dog, which makes things interesting. So that concept of the monstrous races, that kind of leads into your question about how this connects to other cryptid creatures. The monstrous races was actually a phrase. It was a concept that was discussed and debated for hundreds of years, roughly 1,000 years, actually. Throughout the entire medieval period, we had people like Saint Augustine and Rationus of Corbie and all of these, Catholic ecclesiastical scholars debating not even the existence as much as, can they be saved by Jesus or not, which was fascinating to me. So there was all this religious debate about, okay, so, we have these monks and these missionaries who are going out and they're coming back and they're saying, yeah, these tribes of these dog-headed men, do we witness to them or not? Because one of the consistent issues is that they can't speak because their mouth, right? They can't speak human languages. They just use sign language to communicate.
This was a preview of today's member episode. If you want to hear the whole thing, head on over to the confessionalspodcast.com, hit the join button, and become a member today.